we are continuing the story of God as we look at the last of the patriarchs in the person of Joseph. Jacob has manipulated and deceived his way into his brother's birthright, and into his brother's blessing, and into his wealth of flocks of sheep. He really is the culmination of a family history of lying, as a good chunk of his early life was marked with deception. Then, after wrestling with God, he is transformed into a man of stronger faith. But the family's history of deception and how the family has been formed out of it causes problems in his family line. He has 12 sons, the last of which is born to his beloved Rachel when he gets back into the land of Canaan. And this last son, the youngest, Benjamin, is born, and in the process, Rachel dies. So there are 12 brothers with 4 different mothers. And as brothers do, especially when there's so many of them, they fight with one another. And Jacob himself exasperates this problem by choosing to have a favorite, Joseph, the firstborn of his beloved and now passed away, Rachel. He dotes upon Joseph and even gives him a very fancy coat. And Joseph really doesn't help himself in the situation as he pokes and he prods his brothers. He has this dream that he decides to share with his brothers. He dreams that they were out in the field all together gathering wheat, and they each gathered a bundle and put it down. And Joseph's bundle stood up, and all of his brothers' bundles came and surrounded his bundle and bowed down to it. The brothers were indignant about this dream. Who do you think you are? Are we really going to come and bow down before you? But Joseph did not learn his lesson from his brother's reaction to this dream that he had, as he has another dream, and again he decides to share it with everyone. He dreams that he was standing there in the sun and the moon and the stars bowed down before him. And now Jacob was there to hear this one. And Jacob reprimanded his son. What kind of dream is this? Will you, your mother, and me, and all your brothers come and bow down before you? And so the brothers scoffed and grew in their hatred of Joseph. But Jacob, he kept this dream in mind. Now Joseph's brothers were out watching the flocks, and Jacob wanted to get a report from them. So he sent Joseph to see how they were and how things were going, and then to return back home with a report for Jacob. So Joseph put on his fancy coat and he headed out. And eventually he found his brothers, but they could see him coming from a way off, and they grumbled to one another, "Oh, here comes the dreamer in his fancy coat. How about we kill him and then tell our father that he was killed by wild animals? Let's see his dreams come true then." But Reuben didn't want to kill his brother Jacob, and so he convinces them instead to just put him down in this well and leave him there. And then Reuben plans on coming back later, rescuing Joseph and returning him to their father. So they decide, and they grab Joseph, they rough him up a little bit, and they throw him in this well. It was dried up at this time, and then put a cover over top of it. And then Reuben goes off to go tend to the flocks while the rest of the brothers eat their lunch. And as they're eating lunch, a caravan of Ishmaelites heading down to Egypt come by. And Judah comes up with this idea, hey, what is the point in killing our brother if we don't gain really anything from it? How about we sell him to these Ishmaelites as a slave, and then at least we'll make some money off of it. So they wave the Ishmaelites over and sell Joseph to them as a slave. Reuben returns from tending the flock and panics when he sees that Joseph is no longer in the well. So the brothers take the coat that Joseph had from his father, rip it up, they kill a goat, and dip Joseph's coat in the blood. They bring it back to their father and say that they found it. And Jacob comes to the conclusion that his beloved son Joseph has been killed by wild animals. And he mourns and he grieves for his favorite son, believing him to be dead. And he would not be comforted. Meanwhile, Joseph is taken to Egypt, where he is sold to a man named Potiphar. God is with Joseph and blesses everything that Joseph does, and so blesses Potiphar's household because of Joseph. And Potiphar recognizes this and puts Joseph in charge of everything he owns. But now beauty once again becomes a problem. Sarah's beauty and Rebekah's beauty caused Abraham and Isaac, respectively, to fear for their own lives. And here, Joseph's beauty causes problems for him. Potiphar's wife takes a fancy to the good-looking man and tells him to get into bed with her. But Joseph refuses. He's been entrusted with all of Potiphar's household. How could he betray that trust and sin against God? By sleeping with her. But she's not put off, and every day she asks Joseph to get into bed with her, and every day Joseph says no. And then one day, all the servants are out of the household, Potiphar is out of his house, and it's just Joseph and Potiphar's wife left in the house. And she seizes Joseph by the coat and says, "Come into bed with me." But Joseph wiggles out of his coat and flees. And she's feeling slighted and offended at this action, but realizes that Joseph's coat is still in her hand. And so she waits until her husband comes home and says, "The foreigner that you brought into this house tried to sleep with me. But when I shouted for help, he grew afraid and he jumped out of his coat and fled." Well, Potiphar was irate, and so he has Joseph thrown into jail. But God is once again is with Joseph in jail, and he grows in favor with his guards. They eventually placed Joseph in charge of all his fellow prisoners, and the warden didn't have to worry when Joseph was in charge. And during this time, Pharaoh had grown angry with his baker and with his cupbearer, and so they had them thrown into jail. And while they were in jail, they both had dreams that troubled them. And they were discussing their troubles over these dreams when Joseph overheard them and offered to help, as he himself has interpreted dreams in the past. And so they shared their dreams with Joseph. The cupbearer dreamt that he saw a vine that had 3 branches grow on it. And each of those branches grew a bunch of grapes. And he would take the grapes and he squished them in his hand into Pharaoh's cup and placed the cup into Pharaoh's hands. So Joseph says, "Well, your dream interprets this way. The 3 branches represent 3 days. In 3 days, you are going to be restored to your position as Pharaoh's cupbearer. Now, when you are restored, please remember me and plead my case before Pharaoh about how I have been wrongfully imprisoned." The baker saw that the cupbearer's dream had a favorable interpretation, and so he excitedly told Joseph about his dream. He dreamt that he had 3 baskets on his head, and on the top basket was an assortment of baked goods for Pharaoh. But these birds kept coming down and eating the bread out of that top basket. Joseph says those 3 baskets also represent 3 days. In 3 days you will be taken out of prison, and Pharaoh will behead you and impale your body on a pole. Well, 3 days later was Pharaoh's birthday, and he brought his cupbearer and his baker out of prison. And the cupbearer he restored to his position as Pharaoh's official cupbearer, but the baker he beheaded and impaled on a pole. The cupbearer was pleased at his fortune, but he forgot about Joseph, who remained in prison. 2 years later, Pharaoh had a dream that troubled him. He dreamt that 7 fat cows came up out of the Nile and ate the reeds along the shore. Shortly after, 7 skinny, frail, sickly cows came out of the Nile, and they ate the 7 fat cows. He woke up from this dream, startled, but eventually fell back asleep, where he had another dream. There was 7 healthy heads of grain that grew on a single stalk. But then 7 thin, wispy grains of wheat grew and ate the 7 healthy grains. Pharaoh woke up that morning and was greatly troubled by his 2 dreams. He summoned all the wise men and magicians of Egypt to come and interpret this dream, but none of them could. And it was at that moment that the cupbearer remembered Joseph and told Pharaoh about Joseph, how both the cupbearer and the baker had dreams, and Joseph interpreted them, and those interpretations came true. And so Pharaoh brought Joseph into his court and told him his dream. And Joseph said, well, both dreams have the same interpretation. The 7 healthy cows and the 7 healthy heads of grain represent 7 years of abundance. There will be 7 years where you will have really good yields on your crops. And then the 7 sick and unhealthy cows and the 7 wispy, thin heads of grain represent 7 years of intense famine. And they swallow up those 7 healthy cows and 7 healthy heads of grain, because the famine is going to be so intense that the abundance of those previous 7 years will be all but forgotten. Joseph tells Pharaoh that this dream is from God, warning Pharaoh about what's coming, and he ventures to give Pharaoh some advice. Take those 7 years of abundance and store that extra grain. That way, when the years of famine come, you will have food for your people during those 7 years of famine. Well, Pharaoh is so impressed by Joseph that he puts him in charge of looking after the storerooms. And eventually, Joseph comes to be the most powerful man in Egypt, only behind Pharaoh himself. And it happens just as Joseph had interpreted. There is 7 years of abundance and great crops, and then started 7 years of intense famine. So there's an intense famine throughout all the known land, and there is no food anywhere except in Egypt, who had stored all of their extra grain from the years of plenty. And Jacob hears that there is food down in Egypt, and he says to his 10 of his sons to go to Egypt and buy them food to bring back. He sends all of his sons except Benjamin, who he keeps with him, Benjamin being the only remaining son of his beloved Rachel. And so he's become very protective of Benjamin now. And so the 10 sons go, and they come to Egypt, and they come to Joseph and bow down before him, asking for food. Joseph recognizes his brothers right away, but they don't recognize him because he just looks like an Egyptian. And he begins to question them closely, accusing them of being spies coming to scope out their land for weaknesses. But the brothers, under fear of this accusation, answer all of Joseph's questions. Is your father still living in Canaan? Yes, he's still living in Canaan. Do you have any other brothers? Yes, we have one youngest one. We are just one youngest one who still remains. No, you guys are spies trying to spy on our land. No, we are just 12 brothers of one father. The youngest remains in Canaan, and one of us is no longer living. But Joseph says, no, I think you are spies, but this is how you can prove to me that you are not. I want you to leave one of your brothers here with me in prison until you guys go and get your youngest brother and bring him back to me. And so Joseph held all the brothers in custody for 3 days, and then sent them on the way, filled their packs with food, but also placed the silver and the gold that they had brought back into their bags, and had kept Simeon with him in prison. The brothers are on their way back, and they discover all the silver and gold still in their bags, and they grow panicked. This governor thinks that they are spies. He has arrested one of their brothers, and now they have stolen grain from Egypt. They return to their father and report everything that has happened, and Jacob is distressed. He's lost Joseph. Now he's lost Simeon. And now this Pharaoh wants Benjamin. And he refuses to send Benjamin, his new favorite son. So they eat all the grain they have, and eventually they need to go get more food. And so Jacob says, go back to Egypt and buy more food. Whereas they remind him, we can't go back without Benjamin, or else he will arrest us all thinking that we're spies. But Jacob is hesitant. He does not want to send his favorite Benjamin. So Judah makes an oath to him. If any harm comes to Benjamin, then he can take Judah's 2 sons and kill them. That is the promise that he makes. Eventually, finally, Jacob agrees to send Benjamin, and all the brothers go back. They are brought into Joseph's household, where they have a meal with Joseph. And I notice that Benjamin's plate has 5 times more than the rest of them. Simeon's brought out and eats with them as well. And they have this feast, and they apologize for the silver. They didn't mean to take the grain. They thought they paid. And Joseph says, don't worry, I put that silver and gold in your bags. He gets his attendants to go and fill their bags with as much grain as they can carry, but also takes Joseph's goblet and places it in Benjamin's bag. So the sons all head out on their way with the silver and gold that they thought they paid again, but in their bags again, and now Joseph's goblet in Benjamin's bag. And Joseph sends his officials after them and goes with them and overtakes them and says, I have brought you into my house and served you this wonderful meal, and one of you have taken my goblet, my precious goblet. They swear that they hadn't done such a thing, that he could search all their bags, and the one who has the goblet he is free to kill. So the officials search all the bags, and there, in Benjamin's bag, they find the goblet. And the brothers cry out and mourn, what is this disaster that is coming upon us? It is because of how we mistreated our brother Joseph. And Judah steps in and says, my lord, this is my father's favorite son. He's already lost one of his beloved sons. And I have made an oath that no harm will come to this child, to them. So please take me instead of Benjamin. If you take him away from my father, he will die of grief. At this, Joseph can no longer hold it all in. He sends all of his attendants away, and he breaks down in front of them and reveals himself. I am your brother Joseph, who you have sold into slavery. Is my father still alive? The brothers cannot believe it. This is Joseph. The one they sold into slavery, who they assumed was dead, is second in command in Egypt. Joseph tells him to go get his father and bring him to Egypt. There's still plenty of time left in this intense famine, and Joseph has great favor with Pharaoh. So grab their father and bring him here, and Pharaoh will give him a place to stay. So the brothers return to Jacob. They report to their father all that has occurred, and Jacob can hardly believe it. But he gathers his entire family and travels to Egypt, where he is reunited with his beloved Joseph. And Pharaoh welcomes them all and allows them to settle in the land of Goshen. Joseph is the last story of the section that we would call the Age of the Patriarchs. And in the patriarchs of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and now Joseph, we see differences and similarities between them. We see how they each interact with the promises given to them and how they receive them. Abraham receives the promise directly from God, and he obeys God and follows where God leads him. He waits faithfully and patiently for the fulfillment of them, for the most part at least. It doesn't mean he doesn't question God. He questions God constantly, but when God gives him an answer and reiterates his promise, he trusts what God says. And he faithfully waits, except for, like the Hagar and Ishmael part. But for the most part, he awaits. Isaac receives the promise through the blessing of Abraham, and he sits back and waits for it pretty much. Isaac is definitely the most passive out of all of them. Jacob swings to the other side. He's the most aggressive about it. He receives the promise through a prophecy to Rebekah about how the younger will serve the older. But he manipulates and deceives his way into getting that blessing, tricking Isaac to blessing him when he thought he was Esau. Joseph assumes the promise through these dreams that he has, and he goes about bragging and proclaiming it to his brothers. Their stories are also different in how God interacts with them. Abraham has multiple conversations with God throughout his life. Isaac prays to God on Rebekah's behalf and is told by God to stay in Canaan despite the famine. That's only interactions really we get with him. Meanwhile, God speaks to Jacob as he's fleeing Canaan and gives him the promises. He tells him to come back to Canaan from Laban's household, and then he wrestles with him before he comes back into the land of Canaan. And Jacob is also only reported of praying to God once, right before he wrestles with him, as he's fearing the meeting with his brother Esau. Joseph's story, there is no report of God speaking to Joseph. Even the dreams aren't explicitly said to be from God. They're just dreams that Joseph has and he shares. We see that the family tradition of deception has both continued and has had great consequences. We saw that Leah becoming Jacob's wife through deception of her father Laban has great mental consequences upon both her and Rachel. Leah is unloved and Rachel is barren, and this causes significant trauma for them. And it causes the two sisters to view each other as enemies and opponents rather than loving sisters. And this conflict passes down into their children. 12 brothers from 4 mothers and 1 father. And as brothers are, they fight, especially when there's so many of them. And Jacob exasperates this problem by having a favorite son, Joseph, the oldest of his beloved and now passed away Rachel. And because of this favoritism that he has, and already this tension between the brothers because of this family dynamic, there is jealousy and hatred between the brothers towards Joseph. And this culminates in Jacob once again being deceived, the deceiver being again deceived, this time by his own sons, who lie to him and say that Joseph has been killed by wild animals. And Jacob grieves and mourns, and he's at the rock bottom of his life emotionally with this deception, as the entire time that Joseph is in Egypt and Jacob believes he's dead, he's just grieving and mourning and won't be comforted. This does not end, this grief and this mourning. And think of those years of pain and mourning of Jacob and the fear that he has that causes him to be so protective of Benjamin now. And the awkwardness of that conversation when the brothers come back home after finding out that Joseph is in Egypt and telling Jacob that Joseph is alive and is second in command to Joseph, or to Pharaoh in Egypt. And having to explain how that can be when they actually sold him into slavery and lied to their father about him being dead. And those years and years of pain and sorrow that Jacob were caused because of the deception of his sons were all for nothing, and now he's learned that. That's an awkward family conversation to have. Joseph's story also shares a similar theme with his great-grandfather Abraham's. It's a story of anticipation of what is coming, but barriers arising and God overcoming those barriers to his promises. But in Abraham, we see God up front in the story, causing all these things to overcome these barriers that arise. Whereas in Joseph's story, he takes a seat in the back and works in the background, not mentioned nearly as much as is in Abraham's story. And the anticipating is the fulfillment of this dream. The dream of the bundles of wheat bowing down to him, and the sun, moon, and stars bowing down to him, representing his family bowing down to him. But we see obstacles throughout this story of this dream coming true to cause this anticipation of, oh, how is it going to come true? The first barrier is the plot of his brothers, who say, let's kill him. We'll see if his dreams can come true if he's dead. Joseph's life is in danger, and the barrier to that dream coming true is thus in danger, but Reuben steps in and prevents him from being killed. And then a caravan of Ishmaelites come by, and Joseph's life is spared by being sold into slavery. But now, how is his dream going to come true if A, he is in the low position of a slave, no one bows to a slave, and B, if he's in an entirely different land from his family, how can they bow down to him? But barriers slowly gets overcome as Joseph actually rises in the ranks of Potiphar's house and becomes the head of his household. So at least other slaves are probably bowing down to him now. And God blessed Potiphar's household because of Joseph. So we do see actually the promise of those who bless you will be blessed coming true, as Potiphar's household is blessed because of Joseph. But then another barrier arises when Joseph is arrested and thrown in jail. Now he's not just a slave, but he's an imprisoned slave in a foreign country. Again, how is his dream going to come true? But again, he rises the ranks and gains favor because God is with him. An array of hope comes as he successfully interprets the dreams of the cupbearer and the baker. And the cupbearer gets restored to his position as Pharaoh's cupbearer, which also actually has a notion of being an advisor to Pharaoh in there. So there is power in that position as well. But the barrier continues because the cupbearer forgets about Joseph. And it's finally until Pharaoh is given a dream by God. But it's Joseph who tells us that the dream is from God. It's Joseph's interpretation of where this dream came from. And Joseph's able to interpret the dream. And now he rises into second command to Pharaoh. And many people are bowing down to him. But still the barrier is that he's in a different land than his family. And that's where the famine finally comes in. And the famine drives his family to Egypt to get food. And finally we see that dream is fulfilled. And in Joseph's story, we also get this really weird scenario where Joseph toys around with his brothers. What is strange about this story is there is no real purpose stated, and there's no evaluation of the morality of it. The end result is that Jacob and his family move into Egypt, which starts off the prophecy that God had told Abraham when he made the covenant with him, about how his descendants will be slaves for a period of time in a country that's not their own. And that's going to be talked about a lot next week. But that could have easily have been done without Joseph doing any of this deception stuff. He could have just revealed himself right away and told them to move down there. And perhaps it's the continuation of this effect of deception in the family line, and now Joseph is deceiving his family here and continues that theme throughout. Maybe it's just Joseph getting revenge on his brothers, but it's not stated in the text at all. The reasoning behind his deception is quite open-ended. But this in turn allows us to kind of lay this situation upon our own lives and gives it a little bit of flexibility so it can speak maybe a little bit more to our situations than if it was giving a definite purpose or evaluation. There's no moral attachment to the story. It doesn't condemn Joseph for his actions. It doesn't praise Joseph for his actions. It's just there as an event where we are left to fill the gaps. And again, this reflects our own lives. As we don't always know right away whether an action of ours or of others is a good or an evil one, or if it even fits into either one of those categories. And it helps us recognize that there is ambiguity in the Scripture. And it's through that ambiguity that we are able to fully appreciate the power that Scripture has in our lives. The Bible does not always offer us straight answers that apply directly to our lives. Rather, it invites us into a conversation and into a wrestle and a struggle with God as we seek how to live our lives faithfully in this ambiguous world that we find ourselves in. So if we approach the Bible as being something black and white, then we place our own frameworks upon it and we manipulate it to agree with whatever we want it to agree with us on. But if we approach it as something to consider and to converse with, and we allow ourselves to be shaped by the Spirit that works through it and works within us. And Joseph's story does well in showing us how we live in uncertainties. I like this quote from Old Testament scholar and translator John Goldingay. We don't always know the answer to questions like that. And in this case, he's referring, why does Joseph deceive his brothers? We don't always know the answer to questions like that. And we have to live our lives on the basis of partial insights. But we can do that in the conviction that Joseph will shortly express, that God is involved in the whole story, even if we cannot be sure of the significance of even key elements within it. What Goldingay refers to in what that Joseph expresses to his brothers is this. After he reveals his identity to his brothers, he tells them, "Do not be distressed and do not be angry with yourselves for selling me here, because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you." What they intended for evil upon Joseph, God used for good. And God's actions are placed in the background of the story to show us that he is involved in the whole story, even if we cannot be sure of the significance of even key elements within it.